Alfred Hitchcock. That one name conjures up images of films that changed the very face of cinema.
This is a well-known phrase that he was the master of suspense.
Armed with a camera, he was the ultimate magician and puppet master.
Got a place to stay?
With a keen eye and a vivid imagination, he held the audience in the palm of his hand and played with their fears, toyed with their emotions.
The brilliant thing about Hitchcock is his manipulation, the way that he puts you inside the story and fiddled with your head.
From this bank holiday, Sky Movies Classics pays tribute to the celebrated director by bringing you a week of some of his most acclaimed films back to back.
His reputation has grown in the last 20, 30 years.
Hitchcock's great appeal is that he tells a brilliant story.
Well, a boy's best friend is his mother.
He was very seminal and very innovative.
He did thrillers that involved you with style.
It's not about suspense or thrillers, it's about he created his own genre.
What the devil is that supposed to mean?
He really is the father of modern cinema.
Join us now as we take a closer look into the mind of the man whose very name became synonymous with murder, mystery, and MacGuffins.
Hitchcock developed at a very young age a fascination with crime, criminality, lawlessness, death. The things that were part and parcel, really, of his growing up is something that goes back to when he was a kid, when his father took him to the police station after he'd been naughty, and the very friendly police officer locked him in prison. And that obviously was a big seminal moment for Hitchcock in terms of the rest of his life. You know, authority figures in Hitchcock films generally not to be trusted.
Obviously, a film like Psycho was enormously popular. But if you look at the figures for many of them, they're not huge hits. But he was a clever man, and he made films for the audience.
Hitchcock's attention to detail stemmed from a background in title illustration from which he was able to create the pattern for the rest of his career. Every film he went into would be storyboarded to the smallest detail, the images burned into his mind before the camera rolled.
He wrote the titles in silent films because he was I don't think he actually went to art school, did he? But that's what he was good at. He was good at drawing. So he started from a sort of visual premise, really. And he, unlike, I think, anybody else in the world, could somehow make films on paper. He could draw the film, and then the shooting was just a matter of executing it. But I don't know how you do that.
He would storyboard it. He would then have one of his set designers perhaps refine the storyboards. But once he'd made the decision, he very rarely changed a location or even a gesture.
He knew exactly what he wanted. He never shot anything more than he wanted, and he hardly ever took more than one take.
You always know when you're watching a Hitchcock film. For some reason, you just know it's been topped and tailored and edited by Hitchcock. He was matchless in the editing suite. You can tell a good story, but to do it with a camera is a totally different art, of which Hitchcock actually made the film grammar for so many of our films today.
Most of Hitchcock's films are very unnatural. He would place cameras and angles that were very unusual, and nobody else would even think of putting the camera in the places that he would put it. You know, it's only now we analyse all of his movies, but at the time audiences wouldn't stop and go, hang on, why am I sitting on the ceiling?
Who on earth would have gone to Salvador Dali and said, can you just put in 20 minutes of surreal... I'm making a film about therapy. It's called Spellbound. Can you just put in 20 minutes of mind-bending special effects for me? Make it a nightmare.
And then a girl came in with hardly anything on and started walking around the gambling room, kissing everybody. She came to my table first.
And then you have this fantastic sort of swirl of huge eyes and faceless people in tuxedos. It's just, oh. The Hitchcock zoom is obviously, when I first saw that, just, my stomach sort of dropped through my pants. And I felt physically sick watching that, actually, because it really was, I'd get vertigo, it really was like looking over a tall building, and you just go, and it's just one of those shots which are just genius.
Hitchcock's kind of voyeurism comes across in the way he uses the camera. It's always seems to move a little bit too far in, whereas most people would stop here. He's so curious, he just wants to see that little bit extra. So the camera always moves a little bit further than you'd expect. If you look at that shot, for instance, from Notorious, Bergman is holding the key for the cellar, which would imply her guilt. The camera is coming from this incredible distance, all the way down, which of course, whose POV is that? You know, most people took the camera literally, so that you would have to establish who's looking at it. So it's generally the audience's POV.
The bit just before it, when Claude Rains actually, without knowing it, catches her in the act of stealing the key, and the way in which he builds up the tension and then gets her out of trouble. It's wonderful. It's very, very inventive.
It's not that I don't trust you. When you're in love at my age, every man who looks at your woman is a menace. Will you forgive me for even talking about it? I'm very contrite.
Camera's ability to be able to move and to zoom in and to track and to dolly was vitally important, because you wanted to get an emotional lift from your actors without them saying, I'm really sad or I'm really happy. You had to show it with the camera.
In 1959, North by Northwest would reunite Hitchcock for the last time with one of his oft-used leading men, Cary Grant. As ever, audience expectations were exceeded.
I remember seeing North by Northwest in 1956 or something, was it? Well, you'd never seen a film like that before. These huge, wide open spaces, this use of colour. If you were a lad in Nottingham, it was a big event.
My favourite film happens to be North by Northwest, but only because I'm a New Yorker and I loved New York in the 50s, which is when I grew up.
I think it's terribly romantic and rather sexy.
The moment I meet an attractive woman, I have to start pretending I've no desire to make love to her.
What makes you think you have to conceal it?
She might find the idea objectionable.
Then again, she might not.
And of course you've got the scene in the wheat or the cornfield.
North by Northwest is shot in this very, very conventional way. I mean, that he took no interest in directing the dialogue scenes in any particularly imaginative way. He just sort of shoots them.
Whatever you do, don't get on that plane.
And he would punctuate those with these extraordinary set pieces.
Get that figure back from her.
Hitchcock constantly used different buildings, different architecture as characters in his films, as he did with Mount Rushmore in North by Northwest, where you're using part of what Americans would take for advantage.
The whole thing of North by Northwest with MGM, this was an MGM product. They fought him every step of the way. They didn't want the Saul Bass titles. They didn't want the kind of music that Hitchcock wanted. They fought him. They didn't want Eve Marie Saint, sort of a method actress. They wanted Sid Charisse. They didn't want anything. They wanted everything he didn't, and yet he won the day on 3 or 4 very important points. There's that wonderful scene in North by Northwest where they're at the UN. He wasn't supposed to be shooting inside the UN. Robert Boyle, who was his production designer, went in with Hitch and had a hidden camera inside his hat, and so they photographed everything. And when they reproduced it on the sound stages, it was sort of a silk screen or a mat of the East River and everything outside, and then it was sort of the sound stage. But I think it is the most extraordinarily lovely matte shot I've ever seen.
Tell me, why are you so good to me?
Shall I climb up and tell you why?
Hitchcock made Cary Grant infinitely more interesting than he ever was in any other film, ever. Because he just had a way into Cary Grant's psyche. I think he had him by the short and curlies.
I can anticipate him, try to figure out his next move, and then get there ahead of him and catch him with his hand right in a jewel case.
He made Cary Grant act and actually look troubled and angry and jealous, and he got emotions out of him which normally Cary Grant just dribbles off him. He's such a Teflon. Hitchcock's great calling card was his cameo when he would appear. He put himself in films. In a way, I think it shows off his huge ego.
He was a real showman. He really loved the idea that people would remember him as much as they would remember the films.
I think the fact that he's in them was nothing to do with acting. It was just like, Picasso signing Picasso and Hitchcock signing Hitchcock.
Someone didn't show up and he had to fill in. And that's how he started. It was simply to fill in for an extra who hadn't shown up.
I mean, they're ingenious, some of these things. In Lifeboat, I think is probably the best. There's a paper, someone reading a newspaper, and there's an advert for a slimming diet, and there's a picture of a fat person before and a thin person after. And of course, Hitchcock is the very fat man in the slimming advert in the newspaper. It adds nothing at all to the actual film itself, but it's just indicative of his sort of playful nature and what he would do with film. That's probably one of the first things he thinks about, actually, when he writes down the cast list. Number 1, me.
1960 saw Alfred Hitchcock's career take a decidedly darker path with the release of the film that would perhaps define his whole career. Taking his style of direction to a whole new level, Hitchcock turned convention on its head and managed to shock audiences the world over. Taking a shower would never be the same again.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
A lot of the material he wanted to film, a lot of the films that he made, were in themselves rather daring and rather, the word scandalous doesn't really apply, but they had a sense of being in taboo territory. Obviously that all came into that really flowered with Psycho, which was his, biggest taboo movie, because there were so many things in that film that I mean, he almost threw away the rule book with that movie in terms of what the audience are going to expect.
He gets much darker the older that he gets, and when he goes to America, his films take on a totally different tenor, and they become more about the banality of evil. Obviously, Psycho is the iconic film for that.
The content as such was, I felt, rather amusing, and it was a bit joke, And I was horrified to find that some people took it seriously. It was intended to cause people to scream and yell and so forth, but no more than the screaming and yelling on the Switchback Railway.
When I first saw Psycho, when I was a kid, on TV, I got the biggest shock of my life, because I just, I'd never seen a movie where you kill the star after the first 25 minutes. That made it so disturbing. It wasn't the fact that she was killed in the shower. That was pretty sick. And the fact that she's killed by some weird, hideous person wearing a mask with a huge knife. That was pretty scary. It was the fact that it was the star of the film. In this shower, you're going to see something hideous that will probably mean that you will never be able to have a shower again without thinking about this moment. I think that the Psycho scene, which is so beautifully constructed as a piece of filmmaking, is also, one of the most shocking moments in screen history.
The interesting thing is that he used montage and would cut away, so you never actually saw the murders taking place. You never saw Janet Leigh being stabbed. You never saw the real brutality.
And the shower scene is a composite of whatever it is, 80 shots, there's some enormous number of shots, to avoid actually seeing what someone more lazily would do now, which is to show the stabbing itself. And people just went mad about it because they'd never seen anything that violent and that frightening before.
Even now, when I go into a hotel bathroom, I have to draw the shower curtain open immediately to see that the murderer isn't there.
Well, I deliberately made that pretty rough, but as the film developed, I put less and less physical horror into it, because I was leaving that in the mind of the audience. And as the film went on, there was less and less violence, but the tension in the mind of the viewer was increased considerably. I was transferring it from film into their minds. So towards the end, I had no violence at all, but the audience by this time was screaming in agony, thank goodness.
The big thing in the movie for me in Psycho is when Martin Balsam dies on those stairs. And again, Hitchcock's use of the camera was incredible, because it's high up. We're seeing him come here, and then we see this figure coming from the right, holding the knife, And so we see it before Martin Boston does, and it's the scariest thing in the world, because and the way the camera comes down to him and the look on his face, this wonderful expression he has, and then just the slow tip back down those stairs is fantastic, because at that point you think, how on earth is this guy going to be discovered?
There are other little bits and pieces of manipulation which I think defines the art of Hitchcock. One of these is a scene where Norman Bates puts the body of Janet Leigh into the boot of the car and then pushes it into a swamp, and it sticks there and doesn't sink. And you're thinking, for God's sake, sink. So actually what you're doing is that you're actually with Norman Bates at that moment, and suddenly, without realising it, you're sort of wanting Norman Bates to get away with it. An awful, awful thing. That is brilliant. That's brilliant storytelling. The techniques that he used sort of to shoot it, the shots he would take, as well as the storyline, which was light years ahead of anything that was going on, then to have it in black and white, that's seriously cool.
Hitchcock took audiences to places they had never been before, but to get them there, he needed a device. Enter the MacGuffin.
A MacGuffin is sort of it's just a contrived circumstance to sort of set the whole thing in motion.
Well, the MacGuffin was invented in Notorious, wasn't it? That it's the formula of uranium or whatever it is that's in those wine bottles. And what he was really saying is that is of no interest.
It's basically been sold a pub.
He loved sort of the chase and people going from A to B to C to D. And he would use any sort of circumstance to get himself into the mode of being able to make a chase.
Why else would you have decided not to tell her that our little treasure here has a belly full of microfilm?
The classic MacGuffin is when Janet Leigh steals the money. Whatever happens to the money, who cares? By the time she's popped into the boot by Norman, it's a totally different film. Cary Grant, James Stewart wanted to act with this man who could have damaged their career beyond belief with the kind of films that he was making. You know, that's the challenge. Actors, if they really are worth their salt, they would go. You'd be dying to get cast by Hitchcock.
When people talk about the obsession with women that he had with Grace Kelly and many of his leading, Tippi Hedren and many of his leading actors, that he had this kind of slightly creepy, voyeuristic relationship.
Melanie Griffith in some interviews said, "Oh, he was a dirty old man."
But actually, when you see him working, if you see any footage of Hitchcock working with those actors, they love him.
Most of his leading ladies liked him. Ingrid Bergman, I know, fell in love with him.
You know, he was a charming, funny man. And once you got across, obviously, he was hardly the most romantic or handsome or dashing figure. But I think people felt, and women in particular, felt very comfortable in his presence.
I remember watching an interview in which Anton described Hitchcock's shot of Bergman in Notorious in the morning when after she's got drunk, and there's a sort of bun that's come off and is lying on the bed, and she thought this was an absolutely appalling way to treat women, to show them at their most unfortunate. But of course the whole film is a sort of worship of Ingrid Bergman.
There was nothing that he didn't have a say in. So when you got your costume, you had to go and show every single item. I can't now remember if he actually said you need to pad your brow or whatever, but anyway, that's what he wanted. He wanted a much more curvaceous look. And he said, I had to do the same thing with Grace Kelly in To Catch a Thief. He said, there's gold in them there hills. And I don't know what he meant.
Later he became overtly unpleasant, and all that stuff about putting Tippi Hedren in hospital.
I don't think she was warned considerably about the danger she'd be in with those birds being attached to her and pecking at her. He really endangered her, and I don't think he was overly caring about this.
It's one of those things I find quite disturbing, actually, even though I'm such a fan, and it's awful to say, but yes, it does make his films much better.
He wanted to scare the man in the street. He wanted to scare the woman in the street. He wanted to do it in his style, and in the only way he knew how, which was the way he built suspense, the way he used the camera. Even in movies like Frenzy, which people write off as not being one of his strongest films, I personally really enjoy Frenzy, and I think it's a lovely film to look at because it's his return back to London.
Here we are. I'm on the second floor.
Frenzy is probably the most explicit of his films in terms of the detail of the murder, and certainly the finding of the body with the tongue lolling out, with the necktie murder's victim.
I was murdered by Barry, and during the murder, which you don't see, I had grabbed his tie pin, which suddenly Barry realises isn't there. But he realised that because you hadn't seen the murder, you never saw Babs grab the tie pin. So he storyboarded 8 shots. We were told he did them himself. I'm sure he had a draftsman there and he told him exactly what he wanted. And we did those shots very near the end of the film, in which you saw just quick sort of... So he had my murder in 8 quick shots.
I love in Frenzy the shot where the camera comes down the stairs, which apparently began in the studio and ended up on the streets of Covent Garden.
And that was that wonderful scene with Gil Taylor's floating camera coming down.
The camera then came down the staircase very, very slowly, down to the front door, where a man carrying a potato sack crossed the shot, and then he cut on that back to Covent Garden.
He said, we did really good matching in that. That means that the transition from outside to inside, from one location to build the set stuff they built in the studio was very, very good.
Now that shot of the track coming down the stairs and us going up the stairs and him coming down the stairs took a whole day.
I must be soft in the head letting a suspected strangler put his arms round me.
Shows you trust me.
I suppose so.
If there is anything that one could say about Hitchcock's movies that really do make them stand out, it's also the fact that they are darkly humorous as much as they're scary.
He was a mainstream director, he made popular entertainment, he worked for Hollywood, he wasn't in the business of making art or anything like that, or he concealed all of that. He was a clever bugger.
We become a race of peeping Toms. What people ought to do is get outside their own house and look in for a change. Yes, sir. How's that for a bit of homespun philosophy?
He made the film grammar of which we are able to talk about films, how we look at films, how they are made. He invented it. The irony is, he didn't know he invented it. I guess that's genius.
In a career that spanned 6 decades, Alfred Hitchcock's mark on the world of cinema is indelible, and he set the standards by which others dare to follow. To gain an insight into the mind of the man, join Sky Movies Classics for a week of his films back to back, starting on Bank Holiday Monday.